The acrid smell of charred wood still hung in the September air when Catherine Eleanor Hartwell stepped down from the dusty stagecoach, her worn leather satchel clutched tight against her chest. She'd traveled nearly 1,000 miles from Boston to become the wife of a man she'd never met, carrying nothing but hope and a faded daguerreotype of James Morrison, the homesteader who'd promised her a new life in the Colorado Territory. What she found instead were 3 wooden crosses standing, sentinel over fresh graves, and the blackened skeleton of what had once been her future home. The mysterious horseman watching her from the ridge above would change everything, but Catherine had no way of knowing that her greatest trial was also about to become her salvation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Catherine's fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter for what must have been the 100th time since leaving Boston 3 weeks ago. The paper was soft from handling, creased along lines worn smooth by constant folding and refolding during the long journey west. James Morrison's careful handwriting promised a comfortable house, fertile land, and a husband eager to provide for a wife who could bring refinement to the rough Colorado frontier. "Miss Hartwell?" The stagecoach driver's gruff voice broke through her reverie. "This here's Willowbrook Creek, end of the line for you." Catherine looked out at the desolate landscape stretching in all directions, rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional stand of aspen trees already turning gold with the approach of autumn. The air was thinner here than back east, sharp and clean in a way that made her lungs work harder with each breath. It was beautiful in its stark emptiness, but terrifyingly vast for a woman accustomed to the close-pressed buildings and bustling streets of Boston. "Where exactly is the Morrison homestead?" she asked, accepting the driver's weathered hand as she stepped down onto the dusty ground. Her traveling dress, a practical brown wool that had seemed so appropriate when she'd left Massachusetts, now felt woefully inadequate against the endless expanse of western sky. The driver's expression grew troubled as he lifted her trunk from the coach. "That's what I've been wondering about, miss. Usually James meets the stage when he's expecting someone. Been driving this route for nigh on 5 years, and he ain't never missed a arrival before." Catherine felt the first flutter of unease in her stomach, though she pushed it down with the practical determination that had carried her through the death of her parents and the subsequent loss of their modest home to creditors. James Morrison represented security, stability, and escape from the grinding poverty that had defined her final months in Boston. Surely there was a reasonable explanation for his absence. "Perhaps he's been delayed by farm work," she suggested, though even as she spoke the words, they sounded hollow. A man expecting his mail-order bride would hardly prioritize chores over such an important arrival. The driver shook his head slowly, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Farm work don't usually involve smoke, miss. Been seeing black clouds rising from that direction for near 3 days now. Figured it was maybe brush fires, but—" He trailed off, clearly reluctant to voice darker possibilities. Catherine's heart began to beat faster, though she maintained her composure with the rigid self-control her Boston upbringing had instilled. Ladies did not give in to panic, regardless of circumstances. "How far is the homestead from here?" "About 2 miles northwest, following the creek bed. Normally, I'd offer to drive you out there, but the stage has got to make Silverton before nightfall." The driver looked genuinely sorry about this, but schedules in the frontier were sacred things, tied to safety and survival in ways that Eastern sensibilities often failed to grasp. Catherine squared her shoulders and lifted her chin with a determination that would have made her deceased mother proud. "Then I suppose I shall walk. Could you perhaps provide directions?" The driver's admiration for her grit was evident in his expression, though it was mixed with obvious worry. "You follow the creek until you come to a stand of cottonwoods with a lightning-struck oak in the center. Morrison's place is just beyond that, up on a little rise. But miss, if there's been trouble out there, then I shall deal with whatever. I find, Catherine said firmly, though her stomach churned with possibilities she refused to examine too closely. She had burned her bridges in Boston, sold everything she owned to fund this journey. There was no going back, regardless of what awaited her at the Morrison homestead. The stagecoach pulled away in a cloud of dust, leaving Catherine alone beside the creek with her trunk and satchel, surrounded by a silence so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums. She had never experienced such absolute quiet. Even in the dead of night, Boston had hummed with the sounds of civilization. Here, the only noises were the whisper of wind through grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Catherine began walking, dragging her trunk behind her and stopping frequently to rest arms that had grown soft during her years as a seamstress in the city. The creek provided a reliable guide, its banks lined with willows and wild roses that had already begun to shed their petals for the season. Under different circumstances, she might have found the landscape beautiful, peaceful even. Instead, each step forward brought a growing sense of dread that she couldn't quite shake. The first sign of trouble came when she reached the lightning-struck oak the driver had mentioned. From here, she should have been able to see the Morrison homestead, but instead of a house and barn, she saw only a column of black smoke rising lazily into the crystalline September sky. Catherine's pace quickened despite her exhaustion, fear lending strength to muscles that had been protesting the unaccustomed exercise. When she finally crested the small rise that should have revealed her new home, Catherine stopped so abruptly that her trunk toppled over behind her. Where James Morrison's letter had promised a sturdy log cabin with glass windows and a stone chimney, she found only the charred remains of what had once been a substantial homestead. The house had been reduced to a blackened foundation filled with ash and debris. The barn was a skeleton of burned timbers reaching toward the sky like accusatory fingers. But it was the 3 wooden crosses that made her knees go weak with shock and grief. They stood in a neat row beneath a solitary pine tree, each marking a grave so fresh that the earth around them was still soft and dark. Someone had taken the time to carve names into the wooden markers, though Catherine had to move closer to read them through the tears that had begun streaming down her face. James Morrison, age 31, beloved son and brother. The next grave was smaller, clearly that of a child. Timothy Morrison, age 8, taken too soon. The third cross bore a woman's name, Mary Elizabeth Morrison, age 27, devoted wife and mother. Catherine sank to her knees beside the graves, finally understanding the full magnitude of the tragedy that had befallen the family she'd traveled so far to join. James Morrison hadn't simply failed to meet the stagecoach. He was dead, along with what appeared to be his wife and son. The comfortable home he'd promised her had been reduced to ashes, and she was alone in the middle of the Colorado wilderness. With no money, no shelter, and no prospects for survival, the realization hit her like a physical blow. She had no return ticket to Boston, having spent her last dollars on the one-way journey west. She had no friends or family in the territory, no one who even knew she existed. The letters she'd exchanged with James Morrison over the past 6 months had been her only connection to this new life, and now those careful plans lay as dead as the man who'd made them. Catherine had never felt so utterly alone in her life. The vast sky above seemed to mock her with its indifferent beauty, while the endless plains stretched away in all directions, empty of human comfort or assistance. She was a 24-year-old woman with no survival skills beyond needlework and basic housekeeping, stranded in a landscape that could kill the unprepared with casual efficiency. As she knelt there beside the graves, struggling to comprehend the disaster that had overtaken her carefully laid plans, Catherine became aware of being watched. It was a prickling sensation between her shoulder blades, the primitive awareness that had kept humans alive since the dawn of time. She turned slowly, scanning the horizon until she spotted the figure on horseback, silhouetted against the sky. On a distant ridge, the horseman sat motionless, too far away for her to make out details beyond his general size and the fact that he rode a dark horse with white markings. He made no move to approach, but neither did he ride away. He simply watched, as still as a statue, while Catherine struggled with the overwhelming reality of her situation. Fear mingled with a desperate hope in her chest. The figure might represent salvation, someone who could explain what had happened here, perhaps even offer assistance. But it might equally represent danger. A lone woman in the wilderness was vulnerable in ways that her sheltered Boston upbringing had never forced her to consider. Outlaws, hostile Indians, or simply men with evil intentions could pose threats she was utterly unprepared to face. Catherine forced herself to stand, brushing dirt from her traveling dress with hands that shook only slightly. Whatever the horseman's intentions, she refused to cower beside these graves like a helpless victim. She had survived her parents' deaths, the loss of her home, and the grinding poverty that had driven her to answer James Morrison's advertisement for a wife. She would find a way to survive this too, even if she had no idea how. The horseman remained motionless on his distant perch, watching her with an intensity she could feel despite the distance between them. Catherine gathered what remained of her courage and dignity, straightened her shoulders, and began the slow process of figuring out what to do next. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks, and she would need shelter soon. The burned homestead offered nothing but debris and memories of dreams that would never be fulfilled. As if sensing her growing desperation, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of smoke and ash, along with something else, the distant smell of wood smoke from a different source. Someone else was nearby, someone with a working fire, and presumably a place to shelter for the night. Catherine's eyes searched the landscape, until she spotted a thin tendril of smoke rising from a valley, perhaps a mile to the north. The mysterious horseman had vanished while she was distracted, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. Catherine was alone again with the graves and the ruins, but now she had a destination. Whoever was maintaining that fire might have answers about what had happened to the Morrison family. More importantly, they might represent her only chance of surviving her first night in the Colorado Territory. Catherine retrieved her trunk and began the laborious process of dragging it across the uneven ground toward the distant smoke. Each step was a struggle, but she pressed on with the grim determination of someone who understood that stopping meant dying. Behind her, the 3 wooden crosses stood guard over their silent charges, marking the end of one dream and the uncertain beginning of whatever came next. The sun continued its relentless descent as Catherine made her painful progress across. The wilderness, her fine leather boots never designed for such rough treatment, her hands already beginning to blister from the trunk's rope handle. But she refused to abandon her few remaining possessions, the last tangible links to the life she'd left behind in Boston. As darkness began to gather in the eastern sky, Catherine could only pray that the mysterious horseman hadn't been the last soul she would ever see, and that whoever was tending that distant fire would prove to be her salvation rather than another source of danger in a landscape that had already proven far more hostile than James Morrison's letters had ever suggested. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The smoke led Catherine to a sheltered valley where a small cabin nestled against a grove of aspen trees, their leaves already turned brilliant gold in the dying light. A thin stream meandered past the front door, and neat stacks of firewood suggested permanent habitation rather than a temporary camp. Most reassuring of all, warm yellow light glowed from the cabin's single window, promising human presence and the possibility of aid. Catherine paused at the edge of the clearing, her trunk finally abandoned a quarter-mile back when exhaustion had overcome stubborn pride. Her hands were raw and bleeding from the rope handles, her fine traveling dress torn in 3 places from catching on thorny bushes, and her carefully arranged hair had escaped its pins to hang in disheveled strands. Around her face, she knew like exactly what she was, a desperate woman with nowhere else to turn. "Hello," she called out, her voice cracking from thirst and strain. "Is anyone there? I need help." The cabin door opened immediately as if someone had been watching her approach. The figure that emerged was not what Catherine had expected. Instead of a grizzled frontiersman or rough miner, she found herself looking at a woman perhaps 10 years her senior, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent dark eyes that took in Catherine's bedraggled state with swift assessment. "Merciful heavens," the woman said, her voice carrying the soft accent of the deep south. "Child, you look about ready to collapse. Come here this instant." Catherine stumbled forward, relief making her legs weak. The woman caught her arm with gentle but firm hands, guiding her toward the cabin with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for others. "My name is Dolores Ann Whitfield," the woman said, as she helped Catherine up the steps. "And you, my dear, are going to tell me how you came to be wandering around my valley looking like you've been through a tornado." The interior of the cabin was Spartanly furnished, but scrupulously clean. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with shelves of books, an unexpected luxury in such a remote location. The aroma of rabbit stew filled the air, making Catherine's stomach clench with sudden, fierce hunger. Dolores settled Catherine into a wooden chair beside the fire and pressed a cup of cool water into her trembling hands. "Drink slowly," she advised. "Too much too fast will make you sick." Catherine obeyed, taking small sips while studying her unexpected savior. Dolores Whitfield moved with the quiet competence of someone who had learned to rely entirely on herself. Her dress was practical calico, well mended but clean, and her hands bore the calluses of hard work. But it was her eyes that held Catherine's attention. They were kind but wary, the eyes of someone who had learned caution through bitter experience. "Now then," Dolores said, settling into the chair across from Catherine, "suppose you tell me what brings a nicely dressed young lady to my doorstep looking like she's been dragged backwards through a briar patch." Catherine's story poured out in a rush of words. The letters from James Morrison, the long journey from Boston, the terrible discovery at the burned homestead. Dolores listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. As Catherine described the 3 graves and the mysterious horseman who had watched her from the ridge. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Dolores whispered when Catherine finished. "You poor child, you poor, poor child." "Did you know them?" Catherine asked desperately. "The Morrison family? Can you tell me what happened?" Dolores was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with the expression of someone wrestling with difficult memories. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with grief and anger. "I knew them," she said slowly. "James was a good man, if perhaps not the most practical. He'd been writing to you for months, talking about his plans for the future, how he was going to bring civilization to this wild country with a proper wife from back east." Catherine felt her heart clench at this confirmation that James had been genuine in his intentions, that the life he'd promised hadn't been mere fantasy or deception. "What happened to them?" "Raiders," Dolores said, the word carrying a weight of bitter experience. "Been plaguing this territory for the better part of 2 years now. They call themselves the Crimson Brotherhood, led by a man named Silas Kane, who styles himself some kind of frontier warlord. They ride through, take what they want, burn what they can't carry, and kill anyone who tries to stop them. The simple brutality of it made Catherine sick to her stomach. She had heard stories of frontier violence, of course, but they had always seemed like tales from another world, too remote and savage to touch her own carefully ordered existence. Now she was sitting in the midst of that violence, her own life irrevocably changed by forces she couldn't begin to understand. "The territorial authorities," Catherine said weakly. "Surely someone is pursuing these criminals." Dolores's laugh was bitter. "Child, the nearest territorial marshal is 3 days' ride from here, and he's got about as much authority as a scarecrow in a cornfield. The Crimson Brotherhood has been growing bolder by the month, and most folks have either fled the territory or learned to keep their heads down and hope the storm passes them by." "But you stayed," Catherine observed. "I stayed," Dolores confirmed, but offered no explanation for this decision. Instead, she rose and moved to the stove, ladling stew into a wooden bowl. "You need food before you fall over completely. We can discuss the particulars of your situation once you've got some strength back." The stew was the most delicious thing Catherine had ever tasted, though that might have been due to her extreme hunger rather than any particular culinary skill. As she ate, Dolores moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, preparing a sleeping area near the fire and setting out clean water for washing. "You can stay here tonight," Dolores said when Catherine had finished eating. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Catherine felt tears of gratitude prick her eyes. "I can't impose on your kindness. I have no money to pay you, no way to repay your generosity." "Did I ask for payment?" Dolores's voice was sharp but not unkind. "I've been living alone in this valley for 3 years, child. The sound of another woman's voice is payment enough." As Catherine washed her face and hands in the basin, Dolores provided, she found herself studying her hostess more carefully. There was something in the woman's manner that suggested her own story held secrets and sorrows. The cabin was too well appointed for a woman living entirely alone, and several items, a man's coat hanging by the door, boots that were clearly too large for Dolores's feet, suggested recent loss. "Mrs. Whitfield," Catherine said carefully, "may I ask what brought you to this valley?" Dolores paused in her preparations, her hands stilling on the blankets she was arranging. "I came here with my husband," she said quietly. "Confederate colonel, if that matters to you. We were fleeing north after the war, looking for a place where the past couldn't follow us." "And your husband?" "Dead 18 months now. Raiders got him while he was checking the trap lines up in the high country, found his body 3 days later." Dolores's voice was matter-of-fact, but Catherine could hear the pain underneath. "Same band that got your James Morrison, most likely. They don't discriminate much when it comes to killing." The shared grief created an unexpected bond between the two women. Catherine had lost her parents to disease and her intended husband to violence, while Dolores had lost her husband to the same savage men who had destroyed Catherine's hopes for the future. They were both refugees from different kinds of war, thrown together by circumstances neither could have anticipated. "Why do you stay?" Catherine asked softly. "If it's so dangerous, why not leave for somewhere safer?" Dolores was quiet for so long that Catherine thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of deep conviction. "This land killed my husband, but it's also where we were happy for the brief time we had together. I won't let murderers and thieves drive me away from the only place where his memory feels real." She turned to face Catherine directly. "Besides, running away doesn't guarantee safety. Evil exists everywhere, child. At least here I know what I'm dealing with." Catherine nodded, understanding the logic even if she couldn't imagine possessing such courage herself. In Boston, she had always been protected by the structures of civilization, law enforcement, social conventions, family connections. Here such protections were illusions at best, and survival depended on individual strength and determination. "The man who was watching me," Catherine said suddenly. The horseman on the ridge. Do you know who that might have been? Dolores's expression sharpened with interest. Describe him. He was too far away to see clearly, but he was mounted on a dark horse with white markings. He watched me for several minutes, but never approached or called out. That would be Daniel Cooper, Dolores said with certainty. He's got a spread about 5 miles north of here, runs cattle in the high meadows. Lost his wife and daughter to the raiders last spring. Catherine felt her heart clench with sympathy. Another victim of the same violence that had destroyed her own hopes. Is he dangerous? Daniel. Dolores seemed genuinely surprised by the question. Lord, no. He's one of the most decent men in the territory, though he's been something of a hermit since his family was killed. Probably spotted you from a distance and was trying to figure out if you needed help. Why didn't he approach me directly? Dolores's smile was sad but understanding. Because Daniel Cooper blames himself for failing to protect his family, and he's convinced that everyone he cares about ends up dead. He's been keeping his distance from folks ever since the funeral, trying to spare them the curse he believes follows him around. Catherine absorbed this information, adding it to her growing understanding of the complex web of tragedy and survival that defined life in this remote valley. Everyone here carried scars from the raiders' depredations, and everyone had found their own way of coping with loss and fear. As the fire burned low and shadows deepened in the cabin's corners, Catherine found herself thinking about the choice that lay before her. She could attempt to return to Boston, though without money or resources, the journey would be nearly impossible. She could try to reach a larger settlement where opportunities for work might exist, though that too would require resources she didn't possess. Or she could stay in this violent, beautiful valley and try to build a life among people who understood loss and chose to endure despite it. Mrs. Whitfield, Catherine said as Dolores banked the fire for the night. If I decided to stay in the territory, what sort of work might be available for a woman with my limited skills? Dolores studied her carefully. You can read and write, I assume. Basic arithmetic. Yes, of course. I also have some experience with needlework and basic household management. There's always need for a schoolteacher, Dolores mused. The territorial government has been trying to establish schools in the outlying settlements, but it's hard to find educated folks willing to come this far from civilization. The pay isn't much, but it would be enough to live on. The idea sparked something in Catherine's chest. Not quite hope, but the first stirring of possibility. Teaching had never occurred to her as a viable option, but it would provide both purpose and independence. Two things that had been sorely lacking in her plans to become James Morrison's wife. Would that be safe, she asked, given the current troubles with the raiders? Dolores's expression grew thoughtful. Safer than some occupations, perhaps. Schools are usually established in the larger settlements where there's at least some protection, and teachers are generally respected, even by rough men who wouldn't hesitate to harm others. As Catherine settled into the makeshift bed near the fire, her mind was already racing with possibilities. The future remained uncertain and dangerous, but it was no longer completely hopeless. She had found kindness in Dolores Whitfield, learned about other survivors like Daniel Cooper, and discovered that even in this harsh landscape, there were opportunities for those brave enough to seize them. Outside, the wind whispered through the aspen trees, carrying with it the vast silence of the Colorado night. Somewhere in that darkness, the mysterious Daniel Cooper was perhaps wrestling with his own demons, while the raiders who had destroyed so many lives continued their savage work across the territory. But here in Dolores's cabin, surrounded by the simple comforts of fire and shelter and human companionship, Catherine allowed herself to believe that survival might be possible after all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight she was safe, fed, and no longer completely alone. It was a beginning, however fragile, and Catherine had learned enough about loss to treasure even the smallest victories against despair. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the valley, painting the aspen leaves in shades of molten gold that seemed to catch fire in the early morning light. Catherine woke to the sound of chopping wood and the rich aroma of coffee brewing on the stove. Through the cabin's single window, she could see Dolores working with practiced efficiency, splitting kindling with the easy rhythm of someone who had learned to rely entirely on her own strength. Catherine dressed quickly in her travel-stained clothes, acutely aware of how inappropriate her Boston finery was for frontier life. The wool dress that had seemed so practical for the journey, West now felt restrictive and impractical for the kind of life she was beginning to envision. Everything about her former existence, the careful attention to fashion, the rigid social conventions, the assumption that someone else would always provide protection and support, seemed as foreign as if it had belonged to another person entirely. "Good morning," Dolores called out as Catherine emerged from the cabin. "Sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Catherine admitted, surprised to realize it was true. Despite the uncertainty of her situation, she had slept more soundly than she had in weeks, perhaps because she was finally free from the anxiety of the unknown. The worst had already happened. Her carefully laid plans lay in ashes along with James Morrison's homestead, and somehow that knowledge brought its own kind of peace. Dolores set down her axe and wiped her hands on her apron. "I've been thinking about what we discussed last night, about the teaching opportunity." Catherine's pulse quickened. "Yes? There's a settlement called Pine Ridge, about 15 miles east of here. Established 2 years ago by families fleeing the troubles in Kansas. They've been trying to attract a school teacher for months, but most educated folks take one look at the isolation and the Indian troubles and head back to more civilized parts." "Indian troubles?" Catherine asked, adding another concern to her growing list of frontier dangers. "Mostly peaceful these days," Dolores said, though her tone suggested the situation was more complex than that simple statement implied. "The Ute tribes have treaties with the territorial government, but there are always young warriors who consider those treaties suggestions rather than binding agreements. Nothing like the raider problem, but enough to make some folks nervous." Catherine nodded, filing this information away with everything else she was learning about her new reality. "You mentioned that Pine Ridge has been seeking a teacher. Do you know what qualifications they require?" Dolores smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "Child, out here the main qualification is being willing to do the job. If you can read, write, and cipher numbers well enough to teach children, that's more education than half the territory can boast. And the pay? Enough to live on if you're careful. The territorial government provides a small salary, and the families usually supplement with food, firewood, sometimes help with housing. It's not the kind of life you were probably expecting when you left Boston. But it's honest work that serves a real purpose." Catherine found herself genuinely intrigued by the possibility. Teaching had never occurred to her as a viable career. In Boston, such positions typically went to unmarried women from established families who could afford to work for very little. But here, where educated people were scarce and practical, skills mattered more than social connections. She might actually have something valuable to offer. "How would I go about applying for such a position?" she asked. "The territorial education supervisor is a man named Professor Augustus Thornfield. He rides a circuit through the outlying settlements, checking on existing schools and establishing new ones where needed. He's due to visit Pine Ridge next week, according to the last news we had." Dolores paused in her explanation, studying Catherine's face carefully. "I should warn you, though. Pine Ridge isn't exactly a garden spot. It's rough country with rough people, and they've had their own troubles with the raiders. 3 attacks in the past year, though they've managed to fight them off each time." Because they're better defended than isolated homesteads? Catherine asked. Because they're led by a man who knows something about warfare. Samuel Fletcher, former Union Army captain. He's the one who convinced those Kansas families to settle together instead of scattering to individual claims. Collective defense, he calls it. Catherine absorbed this information, beginning to understand that survival in this territory required not just individual courage, but community cooperation and strategic thinking. The isolated homestead model that had claimed James, Morrison's family was apparently less viable than settlements where people could support and protect each other. "Would you be willing to introduce me to Professor Thornfield?" Catherine asked. "Or perhaps provide a letter of reference?" "I'll do better than that," Dolores said firmly. "I'll take you to Pine Ridge myself. It's been too long since I've had a proper conversation with other women, and I'm curious to see how Samuel Fletcher's experiment is working out." The offer was more generous than Catherine had dared hope for, and she felt tears of gratitude prick her eyes. "Mrs. Whitfield, I can't continue to impose on your kindness. You've already done so much." "Nonsense," Dolores interrupted. "I told you yesterday that the sound of another woman's voice is payment enough. Besides, helping you helps me too. If Pine Ridge succeeds in attracting decent people like teachers and shopkeepers, it makes the whole territory a little more civilized." They spent the morning preparing for the journey to Pine Ridge. Dolores insisted that Catherine borrow some of her own clothes, practical calico dresses and sturdy boots that would be more appropriate for frontier life than Catherine's Boston finery. The borrowed clothes were loose in some places and tight in others, but they represented a transformation that went deeper than mere fashion. "You look like you belong here now," Dolores observed as Catherine examined herself in the small mirror above the wash basin, "like someone who can handle whatever comes her way." Catherine wasn't sure she believed that assessment, but she had to admit that the practical clothing made her feel more capable, less like a helpless refugee, and more like someone who might actually survive in this harsh but beautiful landscape. They set out after midday, Dolores driving a sturdy wagon drawn by 2 horses that had clearly been chosen for endurance rather than speed. Catherine's abandoned trunk had been retrieved and loaded into the wagon bed, along with supplies for what would be at least a 2-day journey. As they traveled, Dolores shared more details about the people and places they might encounter. Pine Ridge had been established by 17 families, mostly farmers and tradesmen who had grown tired of the violence and uncertainty that had plagued Kansas during and after the war. They had pooled their resources to purchase a large tract of land in Colorado Territory, creating a planned community that could provide mutual support and protection. "The idea is sound," Dolores explained as their wagon bumped along the rough trail. "Individual homesteads are too vulnerable, too isolated, but a settlement of sufficient size can maintain watch schedules, coordinate defense, and provide the specialized skills that frontier life requires." Has it been successful? So far, they've managed to establish farms, a general store, a blacksmith shop, even a small church. The raider attacks haven't succeeded because they can field enough armed men to make an assault costly, and they've been careful to maintain good relations with the local Ute bands, which helps with some of the Indian troubles. Catherine found herself impressed by the forethought and cooperation such a venture required. In Boston, communities developed organically over decades or centuries, shaped by geography and economics. Here, people were consciously creating civilization from nothing, imposing order and safety on a landscape that offered neither. The journey also gave Catherine her first real appreciation for the scale and beauty of the Colorado Territory. Rolling hills covered in golden grass stretched to distant mountains that rose like cathedral spires against the endless sky. Streams ran clear and cold, supporting stands of cottonwood and aspen that provided welcome shade and the promise of water for both humans and animals. It was beautiful in a way that challenged every assumption Catherine had held about what constituted a desirable place to live. Boston had offered culture, refinement, and the comforts of established civilization. This landscape offered something different, a sense of limitless possibility, of being present at the creation of something entirely new. They made camp that evening beside a small creek, sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat, while watching the sun set behind peaks that turned purple and gold in the fading light. Catherine had never slept under the open sky before, but the vast canopy of stars that emerged as darkness fell was more beautiful than any ceiling she had ever seen. "It's magnificent," she whispered, awed by the sheer abundance of light scattered across the heavens. "It is that," Dolores agreed, "makes a person feel both very small and very much a part of something larger than themselves." As they settled into their bedrolls, Catherine found herself thinking about the choices that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a struggling seamstress in Boston, facing poverty and uncertainty, but still surrounded by the familiar structures of Eastern civilization. Now she was camping under the Colorado stars, contemplating a future as a frontier school teacher in a settlement she had never seen. The transformation seemed impossible, too dramatic to be real. Yet here she was, and the person she was becoming felt more authentic than the woman she had been. Adversity had stripped away the pretenses and limitations that had defined her old life, revealing capabilities and desires she had never known she possessed. "Mrs. Whitfield," Catherine said softly, "do you ever regret coming west?" "Every day," Dolores replied without hesitation. "And I wouldn't change a moment of it. This country takes everything from you. Comfort, security, sometimes the people you love most, but it also gives you the chance to discover who you really are when all the props are knocked away." "And who are you?" Catherine asked. Dolores was quiet for so long that Catherine thought she had fallen asleep. When she finally answered, her voice carried a note of surprised discovery. "I'm someone who's strong enough to live alone and capable enough to help others. I'm someone who can split firewood and shoot game and stand watch against raiders. I never knew those things about myself back in Georgia, never had the chance to find out what I was capable of when necessity demanded it." Catherine understood what she meant. In Boston, she had been defined by her limitations, a woman without family, property, or prospects, dependent on others for everything from shelter to security. Here those limitations mattered less than her willingness to work, learn, and adapt to circumstances that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. The morning brought their first glimpse of Pine Ridge, nestled in a valley between two low hills and laid out with the geometric precision that marked planned communities. Catherine counted at least 20 buildings, including what appeared to be a substantial church at the settlement's center. Fields stretched in all directions, many already harvested and prepared for winter, while livestock grazed in carefully. Fenced pastures. "It looks prosperous," Catherine observed, impressed despite herself. "Samuel Fletcher is a thorough man," Dolores replied. "He spent 2 years studying successful settlements before he convinced those Kansas families to follow him west. Everything you see there was planned and built according to proven principles." As their wagon approached Pine Ridge, Catherine felt her nervousness returning. These people had built something substantial here, creating order and prosperity in the wilderness through careful planning and hard work. Would they have any use for a Boston seamstress with more hope than experience? She was about to find out. Pine Ridge proved to be even more impressive up close than it had appeared from a distance. The settlement's main street was wide and well-planned, flanked by substantial buildings that spoke of permanence rather than the temporary structures Catherine had expected to find on the frontier. A general store occupied one corner, its windows displaying goods that would have been at home in any Eastern establishment. Across the street, a blacksmith's forge rang with the steady rhythm of hammer on anvil, while the smell of fresh bread wafted from what was clearly a proper bakery. Most striking of all were the people themselves. Instead of the rough, weather-beaten frontiersman Catherine had anticipated, she saw families dressed in clean, practical clothing, children playing organized games in a designated area, and women engaged in conversation that suggested education and refinement. This was not a collection of desperate refugees fleeing civilization, but a deliberate attempt to recreate civilization's best aspects in the wilderness. "Impressive, isn't it?" Dolores observed as they drove down the main street, drawing curious but friendly glances from the residents. Samuel Fletcher chose his settlers carefully. Most of these families had means and education back in Kansas. They came west by choice, not desperation. Catherine felt a flutter of intimidation. Would such accomplished people have any use for someone with her limited qualifications? Her experience as a seamstress seemed pitifully inadequate compared to the obvious competence of the settlement's residents. Their wagon drew to a stop in front of the largest building, a two-story structure that served as both general store and community meeting hall. A man emerged from the building before they had finished climbing down from the wagon seat, tall, broad-shouldered, with the erect bearing of someone accustomed to command. His dark hair was touched with grey at the temples, and his blue eyes held the alert intelligence of a born strategist. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, approaching with a genuine smile that transformed his serious features. "What brings you to Pine Ridge, and who is your companion?" "Samuel Fletcher, I presume," Dolores replied, accepting his offered hand with obvious pleasure. "I'd like you to meet Miss Catherine Hartwell. She has a proposition that might interest your community." Catherine found herself subjected to Samuel Fletcher's penetrating gaze, feeling as if he could read her entire history in a single glance. There was nothing hostile in his examination, but she sensed that very little escaped his notice. "Miss Hartwell," he said, extending his hand with the same courtesy he had shown Dolores. "Welcome to Pine Ridge. Any friend of Mrs. Whitfield's is welcome here." "Thank you," Catherine managed, hoping her nervousness didn't show in her voice. "Mrs. Whitfield tells me your settlement has been seeking a teacher." Samuel's eyes brightened with immediate interest. "Indeed we have. Are you by any chance an educator, Miss Hartwell?" "I'm hoping to become one," Catherine replied honestly. "I have the necessary educational background but no formal teaching experience. I understand that Professor Thornfield is expected to visit soon, and I was hoping to speak with him about the position." "Professor Thornfield arrived this morning," Samuel said, his tone suggesting this was fortunate timing indeed. "He's currently inspecting our temporary school facility and would, I'm sure, be delighted to meet with a potential teacher. We've been conducting classes in the church basement, but we're planning to build a proper schoolhouse if we can secure a qualified instructor." Catherine's heart began to beat faster. The opportunity was real, immediate, and apparently welcome. But she knew she needed to be honest about her circumstances and qualifications. "Mr. Fletcher, I should explain my situation fully before we proceed," she said. "I came to Colorado Territory expecting to marry a homesteader named James Morrison. When I arrived, I discovered that he and his family had been killed by raiders, their homestead burned. I have no money, no family connections, and no resources beyond what you see before you." Samuel's expression grew grim at the mention of raiders. "The Morrison place." "Yes, we heard about that tragedy. Terrible business." He paused, studying Catherine, with renewed interest. "You came here to marry a man you'd never met, only to find yourself completely alone in hostile territory. Yet you're inquiring about employment rather than seeking passage back east. That suggests considerable fortitude." "Or considerable desperation," Catherine said wryly. Samuel laughed, a sound of genuine appreciation. Miss Hartwell, in my experience, the two are often indistinguishable. Some of our most valuable settlers have been people who had no choice but to succeed because they had burned all their bridges behind them. Speaking of which, Dolores interjected, I should mention that Miss Hartwell distinguished herself yesterday by walking several miles through rough country while dragging her trunk, rather than abandoning her possessions and seeking easier assistance. She has backbone. Catherine felt her cheeks warm at this praise, but Samuel nodded approvingly. Practical determination is worth more than fancy credentials out here. Miss Hartwell, would you like to meet Professor Thornfield? I suspect he'll be very interested in your proposal. They found Professor Augustus Thornfield in the church basement, measuring the space that currently served as Pine Ridge's classroom. He was a spare, energetic man in his 50s, with the ink-stained fingers and slightly distracted air that marked him unmistakably as an academic. His clothes were practical frontier wear, but his manner of speaking revealed Eastern education and refinement. Mr. Fletcher, he said, looking up from his notes, I've completed my assessment. This space is adequate for current needs, but you'll definitely require a dedicated building if enrollment continues to grow. Professor Thornfield, Samuel said, I'd like you to meet Miss Catherine Hartwell. She's interested in discussing the teaching position. Professor Thornfield's attention immediately focused on Catherine with the intensity of a scholar presented with an intriguing new manuscript. Miss Hartwell, how delightful. Tell me, what is your educational background? Catherine outlined her schooling. Primary education in Boston's public schools, followed by 2 years at a female seminary where she had studied literature, mathematics, history, and basic sciences. It wasn't an extensive education by Eastern standards, but Professor Thornfield listened with obvious approval. Excellent foundation, he murmured, making notes as she spoke. And your experience with children? Limited but positive, Catherine admitted. I helped care for younger cousins and occasionally assisted with church Sunday school classes. I enjoy working with young people and believe I have the patience and temperament for teaching. Most important qualifications of all, Professor Thornfield said firmly. Technical knowledge can be acquired, but natural aptitude for working with children cannot be taught. He paused, studying her carefully. I must ask, Miss Hartwell, what brings you to seek employment in such a remote location? It's unusual for educated young women to venture so far from established civilization. Catherine told her story again, noting how Professor Thornfield's expression grew increasingly sympathetic as she described her circumstances. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, apparently lost in thought. Miss Hartwell, he said finally, I'm going to be quite direct with you. The position at Pine Ridge is challenging in ways that go beyond normal teaching duties. You would be responsible for children ranging in age from 6 to 16 with varying levels of preparation. You would need to teach all subjects: reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history, basic sciences. You would be expected to maintain discipline, communicate with parents, and adapt your methods to frontier conditions. Catherine nodded, understanding that he was testing her resolve rather than trying to discourage her. Furthermore, Professor Thornfield continued, you would be living in an isolated community that faces ongoing threats from raiders and occasional tensions with local Indian tribes. The salary is modest, and the comforts are few. Many qualified teachers have declined the position after learning these details. Professor, Catherine said quietly, 3 days ago, I thought my future lay in ashes along with James Morrison's Homestead. The opportunity to do meaningful work, to help children gain the education they need, to build better lives. That seems like more than I dared hope for. Professor Thornfield smiled, the expression transforming his scholarly features. Miss Hartwell, I believe you may be exactly what Pine Ridge needs. Are you willing to begin immediately? We're already several weeks into the academic year, and the children have been without consistent instruction. Yes, Catherine said without hesitation. I'm ready to start as soon as you'll have me. Excellent. Professor Thornfield began gathering his papers with obvious satisfaction. Mr. Fletcher, I believe we've found our teacher. Miss Hartwell, you'll need to complete some paperwork for the Territorial Education Office, but I can handle those formalities. The position comes with a salary of $60 per month, plus housing provided by the community. Catherine felt dizzy with relief and excitement. $60 per month was more money than she had ever earned independently, and the promise of housing solved her most immediate problem. Where exactly would I be living? She asked. Samuel Fletcher spoke up. We've prepared a small cabin specifically for the teacher. It's modest but comfortable, with its own garden plot and close enough to the school for convenience. Several of our women have been maintaining it in anticipation of finding the right candidate. The community has been very thorough in their preparations, Professor Thornfield added approvingly. They understand that attracting quality teachers requires providing appropriate support. As they emerged from the church basement into the afternoon sunlight, Catherine found herself surrounded by curious residents who had apparently been waiting to meet the potential teacher. Samuel made introductions with the ease of someone who knew every member of his community personally. There was Margaret O'Sullivan, a widow with 3 children who served as the settlement's unofficial nurse and midwife. Robert Hensley, the blacksmith, whose wife Elizabeth had been conducting informal lessons for the younger children. Thomas and Sarah Chen, immigrants from California who ran the general store and had been advocating strongly for established education. Each introduction revealed another layer of the community's complexity and sophistication. These were not desperate refugees or rough opportunists, but educated, purposeful people who had chosen to create something new in the wilderness. The realization was both inspiring and intimidating. Miss Hartwell, Margaret O'Sullivan said warmly, we've been praying for the right teacher to find us. The children need proper education if they're going to have real choices in their futures. The building materials for the schoolhouse are already assembled, Robert Hensley added. We can begin construction as soon as you're ready to commit to staying. Catherine looked around at the faces surrounding her, hopeful, welcoming, but also evaluating. These people were offering her not just employment, but membership in their community. The decision would affect not only her own future, but the education of their children and the development of their settlement. I'm ready to commit, she said firmly. Pine Ridge will be my home, and your children will be my responsibility. I promise to give them the best education I can provide. The smiles that greeted this declaration were worth more than any formal contract. Catherine had found not just employment, but a place where she belonged, where her skills would matter, and where she could help build the kind of future that James Morrison had dreamed of, but never lived to see. As the sun began to set over Pine Ridge, painting the settlement in golden light, Catherine realized that her greatest disaster had somehow become her greatest opportunity. The woman who had been left with nothing had discovered that sometimes nothing was exactly what you needed to begin again. Catherine's first week as Pine Ridge's schoolteacher shattered any romantic notions she might have harbored about frontier education. Her 17 students ranged in age from 6-year-old Lucy Chen, who spoke limited English and preferred drawing pictures to forming letters, to 16-year-old Marcus Hensley, who possessed a sharp mind but resented being taught by someone. Barely older than himself and clearly considered formal education a waste of time, better spent learning his father's blacksmithing trade. The makeshift classroom in the church basement presented its own challenges. The space was cramped, poorly lit, and shared with the storage of church supplies and emergency community provisions. Catherine had to move communion chalices and hymn books every morning before she could arrange her borrowed desks and chairs, then reverse the process each evening so the space could serve its primary religious function. More challenging than the physical limitations were the academic disparities among her students. Some children had received excellent preliminary education from their parents. The Morrison twins, Helen and Henry, could recite Shakespeare and perform complex mathematical calculations. Others, like the three Kowalski boys, whose parents had immigrated from Poland, struggled with basic English comprehension. Catherine found herself simultaneously teaching beginning phonics to some students while challenging others with advanced geography and literature. Miss Hartwell, young Timothy O'Sullivan announced on her third day, raising his hand with the solemn importance that 8-year-olds brought to serious pronouncements. "My ma says you're not married. Does that mean you don't know anything about raising children?" The question sparked nervous giggles from the other students and presented Catherine with her first real test of classroom authority. She had anticipated academic challenges, but not the social complexities of being a young, unmarried woman in a position of authority over children whose parents possessed decades more life experience. "Timothy," Catherine replied calmly, "do you think a person needs to own a horse to teach riding lessons?" The boy frowned, considering this unexpected comparison. "Well, no, I suppose not, if they knew about horses." "Exactly. I may not have children of my own, but I've studied how children learn best, and I care very much about helping each of you reach your full potential. Does that answer your question?" Timothy nodded, apparently satisfied, but Catherine could see similar doubts in other young faces. She would need to prove herself through competence and consistency, earning respect through results rather than relying on automatic deference to authority. The academic work itself proved both rewarding and exhausting. Catherine had underestimated the physical demands of teaching. 6 hours of constant attention, movement, and vocal projection left her hoarse and drained each evening. She found herself developing new muscles from writing on the improvised blackboard Robert Hensley had created from painted wood, and her voice grew stronger from projecting to reach students in the back of the cramped basement. But the intellectual challenges energized her in ways she hadn't expected. Creating lesson plans that could engage both beginning readers and advanced students required creativity and strategic thinking that reminded her of puzzle solving. She developed a system of peer tutoring that paired stronger students with those who needed extra help, fostering cooperation while addressing individual needs. "You're a natural," Margaret O'Sullivan observed one afternoon as she watched Catherine work with a group of struggling readers. "The children respond to you because you genuinely care about their success." Catherine felt a warm glow of satisfaction at this praise, but she was also aware of growing tensions within the community. Not everyone was entirely pleased with their new teacher's methods or approach. The source of most criticism was Jeremiah Kowalski, whose 3 sons were among Catherine's most challenging students. Jeremiah had immigrated to America with dreams of prosperity, but limited English skills and deep suspicion of anything that seemed to challenge traditional authority. He viewed Catherine's innovative teaching methods with skepticism and her unmarried status with disapproval. "In the old country," he announced during a community meeting Catherine was required to attend, "teachers are old men with long beards and strict discipline. Children learn through fear and repetition, not games and fancy methods." Catherine had learned that these community meetings were essential for maintaining the cooperative spirit that made Pine Ridge function. But they also provided forums for grievances and disagreements that could fracture the settlement's unity if not handled carefully. "Mr. Kowalski," Samuel Fletcher responded diplomatically, "we appreciate your concerns about educational standards. Perhaps you could share specific examples of methods that concern you." "She has children teaching other children," Jeremiah said, his accent thickening with emotion. She uses pictures and songs instead of proper books. She allows talking during lessons instead of silence and obedience. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to remain calm and professional. Mr. Kowalski, I use peer tutoring because it helps both the student being taught and the one doing the teaching. Children often explain concepts to each other more effectively than adults can. As for pictures and songs, they help children remember information more easily, especially those who are still developing English skills. You question my boy's English? Jeremiah's voice carried a dangerous edge. Not at all, Catherine replied quickly. I admire your son's bilingual abilities. Being able to speak both Polish and English is a tremendous advantage. I'm simply trying to help them develop their English reading and writing skills more quickly. Professor Thornfield, who had returned to Pine Ridge to observe Catherine's progress, chose this moment to intervene. If I may address Mr. Kowalski's concerns, he said in his scholarly tone, Miss Hartwell's methods are based on the latest educational research from institutions like Harvard and Columbia. What she's doing represents the most advanced thinking about how children learn effectively. This endorsement from an obvious authority figure seemed to mollify Jeremiah somewhat, but Catherine could see that the issue was far from resolved. She would need to prove her methods through results, demonstrating that her students were actually learning and progressing under her instruction. The proof came sooner than expected, in the form of a crisis that tested both Catherine's teaching abilities and her integration into the community. On a grey October morning, 8-year-old Sarah Chen arrived at school in tears, clutching a letter that had arrived on the previous day's supply wagon. Miss Hartwell, she sobbed. My grandmother in California is very sick. Papa says we might have to go back to take care of her, but I don't want to leave school. I don't want to leave my friends. Catherine's heart went out to the distraught child, but she was also acutely aware that the Chen family's departure would be a significant blow to Pine Ridge. Thomas Chen ran the general store that served as the settlement's economic hub, while his wife Sarah managed the postal services and coordinated supply deliveries. Their loss would affect the entire community's viability. Let's talk about this calmly, Catherine said, guiding young Sarah to a quiet corner of the classroom. Tell me exactly what your father said. Through tears and halting explanations, Catherine learned that Thomas Chen's mother was seriously ill and alone in San Francisco. As her only surviving child, Thomas felt obligated to return to California to care for her, potentially abandoning the investment and community connections the family had built in Pine Ridge. Catherine found herself in an unexpected position, not just as Sarah's teacher, but as someone the family trusted enough to confide their dilemma. It was her first real test as a community member, rather than simply an employee. Sarah, Catherine said gently, has your father considered other options, ways to help your grandmother without leaving Pine Ridge permanently? The child shook her head. Papa says family duty comes first, always. He feels terrible about leaving Mr. Fletcher and everyone, but he doesn't see another choice. Catherine spent the rest of the morning thinking about the Chen family's dilemma while conducting her regular lessons. By afternoon, she had developed what she hoped might be a workable solution, though it would require careful presentation and community cooperation. After dismissing her students for the day, Catherine walked to the general store where she found Thomas Chen sorting through inventory with the distracted air of someone whose mind was elsewhere. Mr. Chen, she said respectfully, Sarah told me about your mother's illness. I'm very sorry to hear about this difficulty. Thomas looked up, his usually cheerful demeanor clouded with worry and guilt. Miss Hartwell, thank you for your concern. I know Sarah is upset about possibly leaving school. She's grown very attached to her education and her classmates. Mr. Chen, May I ask if you've considered all possible solutions to this situation? Thomas sighed heavily. Miss Hartwell, my mother is 73 years old and alone. I am her only child. How can I remain here while she suffers in California? You can't, Catherine agreed. But perhaps you don't have to choose between your mother and your community permanently. What if there were a way to bring your mother here to Pine Ridge? Thomas stared at her in surprise. Bring her here? Miss Hartwell, she's an elderly Chinese woman who speaks no English and has never lived outside San Francisco's Chinatown. How could she possibly adapt to frontier life? Catherine had anticipated this objection. Mr. Chen, Pine Ridge has successfully integrated families from Poland, Ireland, Germany, and various American states. We have a doctor in Margaret O'Sullivan, comfortable housing, and a community that values contribution over conformity. Most importantly, we have you and your family. To help your mother feel welcome and secure. She paused, allowing Thomas to consider this possibility before continuing. I've been thinking about starting an adult education program for community members who want to improve their English or learn new skills. Your mother could participate if she wished, or simply enjoy being near her family while contributing whatever skills and wisdom she possesses. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, clearly turning over possibilities he hadn't previously considered. The travel would be difficult for someone her age, he said finally, and expensive. Perhaps not as expensive as abandoning your business and starting over in California, Catherine suggested gently. And as for the travel difficulties, Samuel Fletcher has extensive experience coordinating long-distance transportation. I'm sure he could help arrange a safe, comfortable journey. By the time their conversation ended, Thomas Chen was looking more hopeful than he had since receiving news of his mother's illness. He agreed to discuss Catherine's suggestions with his wife and to consult with Samuel Fletcher about the practical aspects of bringing his mother to Colorado territory. Word of Catherine's intervention spread quickly through Pine Ridge's tight-knit community. By evening, she found herself the subject of appreciative comments from neighbors who had feared losing the Chen family's valuable contributions to the settlement. Quick thinking, Miss Hartwell, Samuel Fletcher told her when he stopped by her cabin that evening. You've potentially saved us from losing one of our most essential families. I hope the plan proves workable, Catherine replied. I may have raised expectations that can't be fulfilled. I doubt that, Samuel said with a smile. Thomas showed me the preliminary arrangements you suggested, and they're quite practical. You're thinking like someone who understands what makes communities work. Catherine felt a warm sense of belonging at this praise. She was no longer just the school teacher who had arrived as a desperate refugee. She was becoming a valued member of Pine Ridge, someone whose opinions mattered and whose contributions extended beyond her formal responsibilities. The success of her intervention in the Chen family crisis also seemed to quiet some of the criticism from Jeremiah Kowalski and others who had questioned her methods and qualifications. Even more importantly, it demonstrated to Catherine herself that she possessed capabilities and instincts that went far beyond her formal education. As she prepared for bed that night, Catherine reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. 6 weeks ago, she had been a seamstress struggling to survive in Boston. 4 weeks ago, she had been a devastated refugee, standing beside 3 graves in the Colorado wilderness. Now she was a frontier teacher whose advice was sought by established community members facing their own crises. The transformation seemed impossible, yet here she was, and the person she was becoming felt more authentic and capable than the woman she had been. Perhaps this was what Dolores Whitfield had meant about discovering who you really were when all the props were knocked away. Catherine was discovering strength, wisdom, and leadership abilities she had never known she possessed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more lessons to plan, more community issues to navigate, more opportunities to prove herself worthy of the trust Pine Ridge had placed in her. But for the first time since leaving Boston, Catherine faced the future with genuine confidence rather than desperate hope. The first snow of winter was falling softly outside Catherine's cabin when the riders appeared on the eastern ridge. She was grading arithmetic papers by lamplight, enjoying the peaceful silence that had settled over Pine Ridge with the early darkness, when the urgent tolling of the church bell shattered the evening calm. 3 long peals, followed by 3 short ones, followed by 3 long peals again. The signal Samuel Fletcher had established to warn of approaching danger. Catherine's blood turned to ice as she recognized the pattern. She had heard this signal, explained during community meetings, but never expected to hear it used. Setting down her papers with hands that suddenly trembled, she moved to her window and peered through the falling snow toward the ridge where Pine Ridge's sentries maintained their watch. Dark shapes moved against the white landscape. Too many to count in the dim light, but clearly a substantial force approaching the settlement with purpose. Catherine's mind immediately went to her students, scattered throughout Pine Ridge in their family homes, and to the community that had welcomed her when she had nowhere else to turn. The cabin door flew open without warning, causing Catherine to spin around with a startled cry. Samuel Fletcher stood in the doorway, his face grim with controlled urgency. "Miss Hartwell," he said without preamble, "we have about 15 minutes before the raiders reach the settlement perimeter. I need you to help coordinate the children's safety procedures we discussed." Catherine's fear transformed instantly into determined action. During her first week in Pine Ridge, Samuel had briefed all adult residents on emergency protocols, including specific responsibilities for protecting the settlement's most vulnerable members. As the teacher, Catherine was designated to help gather and safeguard the children during any attack. "How many riders?" she asked, already moving to gather her cloak and the emergency supplies she had prepared for just such a moment. "At least 30, possibly more. Our scouts report they're flying red banners, which means it's the Crimson Brotherhood." Samuel's voice carried the clipped precision of a military commander, but Catherine could hear the underlying concern. 30 raiders represented a force larger than Pine Ridge's entire adult population. "Silas Kane?" Catherine asked, remembering Dolores Whitfield's stories about the raiders' leader. "Most likely. This is the kind of large-scale assault Kane favors, when he wants to make an example of a settlement that's been too successful for his liking." They hurried through the falling snow toward the church, where other adults were already implementing the defensive strategies Samuel had drilled into the community during Catherine's first month in Pine Ridge. The settlement's response was impressively organized, clearly the result of careful planning and regular practice. Margaret O'Sullivan was directing the gathering of medical supplies and preparing the church basement as both shelter and emergency treatment center. Robert Hensley and the other men were distributing weapons and taking positions along the settlement's defensive perimeter. The women with older children were helping to coordinate the evacuation of non-combatants to secure positions. "Miss Hartwell," Elizabeth Hensley called out as she approached the church, carrying her infant daughter. "Thank goodness you're here. The older children are already in the basement, but some of the younger ones are frightened and asking for you." Catherine descended into the church basement to find 17 children huddled together in the space that served as her daily classroom. The familiar surroundings seemed to provide some comfort, but she could see fear in young faces that had never before experienced the reality of violent danger. "Miss Hartwell," 6-year-old Lucy Chen whispered, clinging to her older brothers. "And are the bad men really coming to hurt us?" Catherine knelt beside the frightened child, drawing on reserves of calm she hadn't known she possessed. "Lucy, remember what we learned about brave pioneers who built communities in the wilderness. Sometimes brave people have to protect what They've built from people who want to take it away. That's what's happening now. But will they hurt our families? Timothy O'Sullivan asked, his 8-year-old bravado cracking to reveal genuine terror. The adults are going to protect us, Catherine said firmly. Mr. Fletcher and your fathers and mothers have planned very carefully for situations like this. Our job is to stay here safely while they handle the problem. 16-year-old Marcus Hensley, who had initially resented Catherine's authority, surprised her by stepping forward with mature composure. Miss Hartwell, what can I do to help? I should be up there with the men, not hiding down here with the children. Catherine felt a surge of pride at Marcus's courage, but she also understood Samuel Fletcher's wisdom in keeping the older boys with the younger children. Marcus, I need you to help me keep everyone calm and organized. That's just as important as fighting, and it requires just as much bravery. Outside, the sounds of approaching conflict grew closer. Catherine could hear shouted commands, the thunder of many horses, and the ominous sound of gunfire beginning to echo across the settlement. The children pressed closer together, and Catherine found herself becoming the anchor of stability they desperately needed. Let's sing, she suggested, remembering how music had helped calm her students during thunderstorms and other minor crises. Who remembers the song we learned about the brave little candle? The children's voices were thin and wavering at first, but the familiar melody seemed to provide comfort and distraction from the growing chaos above. Catherine led them through several songs she had taught them, using music as both comfort and mask for the sounds of battle that were growing increasingly intense. The basement's small windows allowed glimpses of the nightmare unfolding outside. Catherine could see the orange glow of fires reflected against the falling snow, and she fought down rising panic as she realized that buildings were burning. Pine Ridge, the carefully planned community that had become her home and hope, was under assault by forces that seemed determined to destroy everything its residents had built. Miss Hartwell, Helen Morrison whispered, what if they get inside the church? Catherine had been dreading this question, knowing that the children's safety depended partly on their confidence in the adults' ability to protect them. If that happens, she said carefully, we follow the plan Mr. Fletcher taught us. We stay together, we stay quiet, and we trust that the adults will handle the situation. But privately, Catherine was preparing for possibilities that Samuel Fletcher's briefings had only hinted at. If the raiders breached the church's defenses, she would need to make decisions about protecting 17 children with whatever means were available to her. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but there was no one else to shoulder it. The sounds of battle seemed to intensify, and Catherine could distinguish individual gunshots now, along with shouted commands and the screams of wounded men. Through the small basement windows, she could see figures moving through the settlement, some clearly Pine Ridge defenders, others that must be raiders. They're in the settlement, Marcus Hensley observed grimly, his young face showing a maturity that war and violence forced upon frontier children far too early. Catherine nodded, abandoning any pretense that this was simply a minor disturbance. Everyone stay together, she said firmly. No matter what happens, we stay together. The church door above them slammed open with tremendous force, and heavy footsteps echoed across the wooden floor. Catherine's heart hammered as she heard multiple voices, rough, unfamiliar voices that clearly didn't belong to Pine Ridge residents. Search everywhere, a harsh voice commanded. Cain wants anything valuable, and he especially wants anyone who might have information about other settlements in the territory. Catherine felt the children pressing closer to her, their terror palpable in the small space. She put her finger to her lips, signaling for absolute silence, and was proud to see even the youngest children responding with desperate self-control. The footsteps above moved methodically around the church, accompanied by the sounds of items being overturned and searched. Catherine could hear the raiders discussing their findings, their voices growing closer to the basement entrance. "What? About down there?" a second voice asked. "Just storage, looks like. Church supplies and some school stuff." Catherine held her breath, praying that the raiders would dismiss the basement as unimportant. The children were absolutely motionless now, understanding instinctively that their lives might depend on remaining undetected. But her prayers were answered by the sudden eruption of gunfire from very close by, followed by shouts of alarm and the sound of running feet. The raiders above them were apparently being engaged by Pine Ridge defenders who had reached the church. "Get out! Get out!" someone shouted, and the sounds of conflict moved away from directly overhead. Catherine remained, motionless for several more minutes, listening to the battle rage around the settlement. Through the small windows, she could see that the fires were spreading. At least 3 buildings were now burning brightly against the snowy night, sending sparks and smoke into the darkness. "Miss Hartwell," young Sarah Chen whispered. "Is my Papa safe?" Catherine's heart broke at the question, knowing that she had no way to provide reassurance that might prove false. "Sarah, your papa is very smart and very brave. He knows how to take care of himself and your mama." But even as she spoke these comforting words, Catherine was acutely aware that the battle raging outside could claim any of the people she had come to care about. Thomas Chen, who had trusted her advice about his mother, Margaret O'Sullivan, who had welcomed her into the community's circle of women, Samuel Fletcher, who had given her a chance to prove herself when she had nothing to offer but hope and determination. The sounds of fighting seemed to ebb and flow like a tide, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close. Catherine found herself listening for familiar voices, straining to distinguish between the shouts of defenders and attackers, hoping for some sign that Pine Ridge was successfully repelling the assault. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the gunfire stopped. The silence that followed was more frightening than the sounds of battle had been, because it offered no clues about who had emerged victorious. Catherine and the children waited in the basement, afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid to hope. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before they heard footsteps approaching the church again. But this time, the voice that called out was blessedly familiar. "Miss Hartwell, children, are you all right down there? Mr. Fletcher!" Catherine called back, relief flooding through her voice. "We're all here. Is it over?" "It's over," Samuel confirmed, his voice heavy with exhaustion but unmistakably triumphant. "You can come up now." Catherine led the children up from the basement to find Samuel Fletcher standing in the church's main room, his clothes torn and bloody, his face blackened with smoke, but very much alive. Behind him, other Pine Ridge residents were beginning to gather, some wounded, all exhausted, but clearly victorious. "The raiders?" Catherine asked. "Driven off," Samuel said grimly. "We killed at least 8 of them and wounded more. The rest retreated when they realized we were better organized and more determined than they expected." Catherine felt her knees go weak with relief, but she forced herself to remain strong for the children who were looking to her for guidance. "What about our people? The settlement?" Samuel's expression grew somber. "We lost 2 good men. Frank Morrison and James O'Brien. Several others are wounded but will recover. As for buildings, we lost the general store and 2 houses, but the rest of the settlement is intact." The cost of victory was sobering, but Catherine understood that it could have been much worse. Pine Ridge had faced its greatest test and survived, proving that Samuel Fletcher's vision of collective defense could work against even determined assault. As the children were reunited with their families and the community began the grim work of assessing damage and caring for the wounded, Catherine found herself thinking about what the night's events meant for her own future. She had proven herself not just as a teacher, but as someone who could be trusted with the settlement's most precious responsibility, the safety of its children. Pine Ridge had survived the Crimson Brotherhood's assault, But Catherine understood that this victory would not end the threat. If anything, it might make the settlement a greater target for future attacks. The question was whether she had the courage to remain in a place where such dangers were a constant reality. Looking around, at the faces of people who had become her family, Catherine realized that the answer was already clear. Pine Ridge was her home now, and these people were her responsibility. Whatever came next, she would face it here, among those who had proven that civilization could take root and flourish even in the most challenging circumstances. The woman, who had arrived as a desperate refugee, had become a defender of everything she had learned to value most. The weeks following the Crimson Brotherhood's failed assault brought unexpected changes to Pine Ridge, not least of which was the arrival of help from sources Catherine had never anticipated. 3 days after the attack, as the community worked to rebuild the destroyed buildings and tend their wounded, a lone rider appeared on the eastern ridge, the same vantage point where the raiders had first been spotted. Catherine was helping. Margaret O'Sullivan changed bandages for the wounded when young Henry Morrison came running to the makeshift medical station they had established in the church. "Miss Hartwell, Mrs. O'Sullivan," the boy called breathlessly. "There's a man on horseback up on the ridge, and Mr. Fletcher says you should come see." Catherine's blood chilled at the thought of more raiders, but Margaret seemed oddly unsurprised by this news. "Let me guess," she said dryly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Dark horse with white markings?" Henry nodded eagerly. "Yes, ma'am, and he's got supplies loaded on a pack mule. Mr. Fletcher thinks he might want to help us." Catherine followed Margaret outside, squinting against the brilliant winter sunlight reflecting off fresh snow. The rider sat motionless on the ridge, just as he had weeks ago when Catherine first arrived at the burned Morrison homestead. But now she could see more details. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in practical frontier clothing, and he did indeed have a heavily loaded pack animal with him. "That would be Daniel Cooper," Margaret said with certainty. "I wondered when he'd finally decide to get involved." Samuel Fletcher approached from the direction of the rebuilt perimeter fortifications, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "He's been up there for an hour," he reported. "Not moving, not approaching, just watching. But those supplies he's carrying suggest he means to help rather than threaten." Catherine remembered Dolores Whitfield's description of Daniel Cooper, the rancher who had lost his wife and daughter to raiders and had subsequently withdrawn from human contact out of guilt and fear. "Should someone go speak with him?" "Someone should," Samuel agreed, "but it needs to be the right person. Daniel's been avoiding human contact for months. If we approach wrong, he'll just disappear again." Margaret O'Sullivan studied the distant figure with the assessing eye of someone who understood trauma and healing. "Miss Hartwell, I think you should go." Catherine stared at her in surprise. "Me? But I don't even know the man. Surely you or Mr. Fletcher would be more appropriate." "Daniel's been watching this settlement for weeks," Margaret explained. "More importantly, he was watching you the day you arrived at the Morrison place. There's something about your situation that speaks to him. Maybe because you both lost everything and had to find ways to rebuild." Samuel nodded slowly. "Margaret's right. Daniel knew your intended husband, felt guilty that he couldn't warn James Morrison about the raiders' planned attack. He's been carrying that guilt along with everything else." The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. Daniel Cooper had known James Morrison, had perhaps watched the homestead burn, had seen her arrive to find only graves and ashes. No wonder he had observed her with such intensity that first day. "What exactly am I supposed to say to him?" Catherine asked, feeling the weight of responsibility for what might be a crucial moment for both the mysterious rancher and Pine Ridge's future. "The truth," Margaret said simply. "About what you've found here, about what we're trying to build." About why it matters enough to fight for, Catherine borrowed one of the settlement's horses and rode slowly toward the ridge, acutely aware that Daniel Cooper could disappear at any moment if she made the wrong move. As she climbed the slope, she could see him more clearly, a man perhaps 10 years older than herself, with dark hair touched by premature grey and eyes that held the kind of deep sadness she recognized from her own darkest moments. He didn't flee as she approached, but neither did he display any welcome. His horse shifted nervously, responding to its rider's tension, while the pack mule stood patiently loaded with supplies that could mean the difference between Pine Ridge's recovery and its slow decline. "Mr. Cooper?" Catherine called when she was close enough for normal conversation. "I'm Catherine Hartwell, Pine Ridge's school teacher. Mr. Fletcher thought you might want to talk." Daniel Cooper studied her with penetrating intensity, his gaze taking in everything from her practical frontier clothing to the confidence in her posture that had been entirely absent when he'd first observed her at the Morrison graves. "You're the woman who was supposed to marry James Morrison," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse and emotion. "I am," Catherine replied honestly, "though I never had the chance to meet him." "James was a good man," Daniel said, pain evident in his voice, optimistic, maybe too trusting, but decent. "He talked about you constantly, his plans for the future, how he was going to show you that the frontier could be a place for refinement and education, not just survival." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at this glimpse of the man she had never known, but whose death had inadvertently led her to find her true calling. "I wish I could have met him. I should have warned him," Daniel continued, the words seeming to tear from his throat. "I knew the Crimson Brotherhood was operating in this area. I'd had my own encounters with them, lost my own." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Mr. Cooper," Catherine said gently, "from what I understand, the raiders struck without warning. Even if you had tried to warn Mr. Morrison, there might not have been time." Daniel's laugh was bitter. "You don't understand. I did see the signs, tracks, abandoned campsites, reports from other ranchers. I could have ridden to warn every isolated homestead in the territory. Instead, I stayed on my own spread, telling myself it wasn't my responsibility to look after everyone else." Catherine began to understand the depth of guilt that had driven Daniel Cooper into isolation. He blamed himself not just for his own family's death, but for every subsequent victim of the raiders he might have saved through warnings or coordinated defense. "And now?" she asked carefully. Daniel gestured toward Pine Ridge below them, where the sounds of rebuilding and recovery drifted up through the clear air. "Now I see people doing what I should have done from the beginning, standing together, fighting back, refusing to let evil triumph without resistance." Catherine seized on this opening. "It's not too late to be part of that resistance. Pine Ridge could use your help, your knowledge of the territory, your experience with the raiders." "I'm not good for communities," Daniel said harshly. "Everyone I care about ends up dead. Better to stay away, keep my curse to myself." "Mr. Cooper," Catherine said, her voice carrying a firmness that surprised them both, "I understand something about believing you're cursed. I thought I was doomed to poverty and dependence, convinced that every plan I made would end in disaster. But sometimes what feels like a curse is just life testing whether you're strong enough to help others." Daniel stared at her, clearly not expecting such directness from someone he barely knew. Catherine pressed her advantage. "Look at those supplies you've brought. You rode here not because you're cursed, but because you're decent, because you see people trying to build something good and you want to help, even if you're afraid of getting too close." "Those supplies don't make up for the deaths I could have prevented," Daniel said. "No, they don't," Catherine agreed, "but they might prevent future deaths. And isn't that what really matters? Not the past we can't change, but the future we can still influence." For a long moment, Daniel Cooper sat silently on his horse, staring down at Pine Ridge while wrestling with demons Catherine could only imagine. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of desperate hope. "What would I do? In the settlement, I mean. I'm not good with people anymore, not good with normal life." "You do what you're good at," Catherine replied. "Scouting, tracking, early warning systems. Samuel Fletcher is an excellent military strategist, but he doesn't know this territory the way you do. Your knowledge could save lives. And if people start dying again, if my presence brings bad luck," Catherine smiled sadly. "Mr. Cooper, people are already dying. The question is whether you're going to help us save some of them or keep hiding while others do the fighting." The brutal honesty of her words seemed to cut through Daniel's self-protective barriers. He looked at her with something approaching respect, recognizing a kindred spirit who had also faced impossible choices and found unexpected strength. "James Morrison was right about you," he said finally. "He said you had backbone, that you'd proven it by being willing to travel halfway across the country to marry a man you'd never met. He thought you'd be good for frontier life." "He was right," Catherine said, though not in the way either of us expected. Daniel made his decision with the same decisive action that had probably kept him alive through years of frontier dangers. "I'll come down. I'll talk to Fletcher about what kind of help I can provide, but I won't live in the settlement itself. I need space, distance." "There's a cabin about a mile north of town," Catherine suggested, remembering her conversations with various residents. "It belonged to a family that moved on to Oregon. You could base yourself there, close enough to help, but far enough for privacy." Daniel nodded, accepting this compromise. As they rode down toward Pine Ridge together, Catherine found herself studying this enigmatic man who had inadvertently played such a crucial role in her own journey. His presence at the Morrison homestead had been her first glimpse of hope in the Colorado Territory, even though she hadn't understood its significance at the time. "Mr. Cooper," she said as they approached the settlement's outskirts, "may I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead. When you saw me that day at the Morrison place, why didn't you approach? Why didn't you offer help directly?" Daniel was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of profound regret. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I told myself that anyone who came looking for James Morrison was probably better off discovering the truth and leaving the territory entirely. Because I didn't want to be responsible for another person's safety or survival. And now," Daniel looked around at Pine Ridge's buildings, at the people working together to repair and improve their community, at the children playing in the snow, while their parents rebuilt what the raiders had tried to destroy. "Now I think maybe some things are worth being responsible for," he said quietly. The arrival of Daniel Cooper marked another turning point in Catherine's frontier education. She had successfully recruited not just a valuable ally for Pine Ridge's defense, but a man whose knowledge and skills could help protect the entire region from future raider attacks. More importantly, she had helped someone find his way back from the kind of isolation and despair that she herself had experienced. As Daniel met with Samuel Fletcher to discuss coordination strategies and early warning systems, Catherine found herself reflecting on how much her role in the community had expanded beyond teaching. She was becoming someone others turned to for guidance and problem-solving, a person whose judgment was trusted and whose advice was sought. The woman who had arrived as a desperate refugee was evolving into a leader whose influence extended far beyond the confines of any classroom. And with Daniel Cooper's expertise now available to help protect Pine Ridge, Catherine began to hope that they might actually succeed in building the kind of permanent, thriving community that could serve as a beacon of civilization in the wilderness. But even as she celebrated this victory, Catherine sensed that greater challenges lay ahead. The Crimson Brotherhood's defeat at Pine Ridge would not go unanswered, and Silas Kane was not the kind of man who accepted failure gracefully. The settlement had won a battle, but the war for the territory's future was far from over. Spring arrived early in the Colorado Territory that year, bringing with it both hope and the most dangerous challenge Pine Ridge had yet faced. The settlement had spent the winter months fortifying their defenses, training their militia, and building the alliances that Daniel Cooper's knowledge of the region had made possible. But as the snow melted and travel became easier, intelligence reports filtering through Cooper's network of contacts brought increasingly disturbing news. Silas Kane had not forgotten Pine Ridge's successful resistance to his autumn assault. Throughout the winter, the Crimson Brotherhood had been consolidating their forces, recruiting new members from among the desperate and lawless, and planning what Kane openly boasted would be the complete destruction of the uppity settlement that thinks it can stand against the natural order of frontier justice. Catherine first learned of the gathering threat during a community meeting in early April, when Daniel Cooper made one of his rare appearances in the settlement to brief Samuel Fletcher and the other leaders on what his scouts had discovered. "Kane's assembled nearly 100 men," Daniel reported, his weathered face grim in the lamplight of the meeting room. "They're camped about 50 miles northeast, in the Badlands where territorial law doesn't reach. He's been promising them rich plunder from Pine Ridge's success, our livestock, our supplies, our women and children to sell in the slave markets down south." The room fell silent as the full implications of this intelligence sank in. 100 raiders represented a force 5 times larger than anything Pine Ridge could field, even with the militia training Samuel Fletcher had implemented over the winter months. "When?" Samuel asked, his military mind already working through defensive possibilities. "Soon," Daniel replied. "My contacts suggest they're waiting for the mountain passes to clear completely, which gives us maybe 2 weeks to prepare." Catherine felt her stomach clench with familiar fear, but it was different now from the helpless terror she had experienced during her first encounter with frontier violence. This time, she had people to protect. Her students, her community, the life she had built from the ashes of her original dreams. "What about territorial intervention?" asked Robert Hensley, ever practical. "Surely the government can't ignore a force of that size operating within their jurisdiction." Daniel's expression grew even grimmer. "The nearest territorial troops are garrisoned 300 miles away, and Kane has made sure to time his assault for when they're committed to other operations. We're on our own." Thomas Chen, whose elderly mother had indeed made the journey from California and had become a beloved figure in the settlement, spoke up with the quiet determination that had made him such a valuable community member. "Then we fight with what we have. This settlement represents everything my family came to America to find: freedom, opportunity, the chance to build something lasting. I won't see it destroyed by lawless men." His words sparked a chorus of agreement from around the room, but Catherine could see the fear beneath the brave declarations. These were farmers and shopkeepers, teachers and craftsmen, good people who had learned to defend themselves, but not professional soldiers facing a vastly superior force. "There might be another option," Catherine said quietly, the idea forming even as she spoke. Around the room, faces turned toward her with the attention that had become her due as one of Pine Ridge's most respected voices. "I'm listening," Samuel said. Catherine took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to propose would be dangerous and controversial. "Mr. Cooper, you said Kane has been recruiting from among the desperate and lawless. What kind of men are we talking about? Professional killers, or mostly people driven to desperate measures by circumstances?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "Mixed, from what I understand. Kane's core followers are hardened criminals, men who enjoy violence for its own sake. But many of his recent recruits are just people who've lost everything: failed farmers, displaced families, men who can't find honest work. Then perhaps some of them could be convinced to reconsider their allegiance," Catherine suggested, "if they were offered a better alternative." Samuel leaned forward with interest. "What are you thinking, Miss Hartwell?" Catherine's mind was racing now, connecting ideas that had been percolating since her successful intervention in various community crises. What if we could split Kane's forces, offer amnesty and settlement opportunities to those who are only with him out of desperation, while isolating the true criminals who can't be reasoned with? That's actually brilliant, Margaret O'Sullivan said slowly. Divide and conquer, but through hope rather than force. It's also incredibly dangerous, Daniel pointed out. Making contact with Kane's forces would require someone to approach their camp under a flag of truce. Kane might respect such traditions, or he might simply kill any messenger who brought terms he didn't like. Then we'd better make sure our messenger is someone he'd be reluctant to kill, Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The room fell silent as everyone understood what she was suggesting. Samuel Fletcher's voice was carefully controlled when he spoke. "Miss Hartwell, I cannot and will not allow you to put yourself in such danger. You're too valuable to this community to risk on a diplomatic mission that might well prove suicidal." "With respect, Mr. Fletcher," Catherine replied, "I don't think any of us have the luxury of avoiding risk anymore. And I'm not suggesting this out of reckless bravery. I genuinely believe it might work." She stood, moving to the map Daniel had sketched of Kane's camp and the surrounding territory. "Think about it strategically. Kane expects us to cower behind our defenses, waiting for him to attack at a time and place of his choosing. He won't expect a young woman to ride into his camp offering negotiations. The surprise alone might buy us the time we need to present our terms." "And if he simply takes you prisoner?" Margaret asked, her maternal concern evident. "Then Pine Ridge will know that negotiation failed, and you'll implement whatever military solution Mr. Fletcher and Mr. Cooper believe offers the best chance of survival," Catherine replied practically. "My capture wouldn't materially weaken our defenses, but successful negotiations could save dozens of lives on both sides." The debate that followed was intense and emotional, with most community members arguing against allowing Catherine to risk herself on what many saw as a desperate gamble. But gradually, as the strategic merits of her proposal became clear, opinion began to shift. Daniel Cooper, surprisingly, became one of her strongest supporters. "It's the kind of unexpected move that could work precisely because it's so audacious," he argued. "Kane's spent months planning to attack a defensive position. He hasn't prepared for diplomatic overtures, especially from someone like Miss Hartwell." "What exactly would you offer these potential defectors?" Samuel asked, clearly struggling. Between his protective instincts and his recognition that Catherine's plan might be their best hope. Catherine had been thinking about this since the idea first occurred to her. Land grants in territories away from Kane's influence, assistance with starting new lives, tools, seeds, livestock from our own reserves. Most importantly, the chance to be part of building something positive instead of destroying what others have created. And for Kane himself, safe passage out of Colorado territory, with a warning that any return would bring the full weight of territorial justice down on him, Catherine replied. "Some criminals can be reformed, but from what I understand about Kane, he's not one of them. The best we can hope for is to convince him that conquest of Pine Ridge isn't worth the cost." The final decision came down to a community vote, as all major decisions did in Pine Ridge. When the ballots were counted, Catherine's proposal had passed by a narrow margin, not because people weren't afraid for her safety, but because they recognized that conventional defense against such overwhelming odds offered little hope of success. Preparations for Catherine's mission took 3 days of careful planning. Samuel Fletcher briefed her on diplomatic protocols and negotiation strategies. Daniel Cooper provided detailed intelligence about Kane's camp layout and the personalities of his key lieutenants. Margaret O'Sullivan insisted on teaching her basic first aid and survival skills, just in case the worst happened. Most emotionally difficult was saying goodbye to her students, though she tried to present the journey as simply another community responsibility rather than the potentially suicidal mission it might prove to be. "Miss Hartwell," young Sarah Chen asked on Catherine's last day of classes before departing, "when will you be back?" "Soon, I hope," Catherine replied honestly. "While I'm gone, I want you all to help Mrs. Hensley with your lessons. When I return, I'll expect you to show me how much you've learned." The confidence in her voice was partly real and partly performance, but it seemed to reassure the children that this departure was temporary rather than permanent. Catherine set out for Kane's camp at dawn on a crisp spring morning, riding alone under a white flag that Daniel Cooper had fashioned from one of the settlement's precious bedsheets. Her saddlebags contained copies of the amnesty offer, along with enough supplies for several days of travel. The journey to Kane's camp took her through some of the most beautiful country she had seen since arriving in Colorado Territory, rolling hills carpeted with wildflowers, crystal streams reflecting the snow-capped peaks that rose in all directions. Under different circumstances, it would have been a delightful ride. Instead, Catherine found herself acutely aware that she might be seeing this landscape for the last time. The Crimson Brotherhood's camp was even larger than Daniel's reports had suggested. Catherine counted at least 90 tents and lean-tos, scattered across a natural amphitheater in the Badlands, with smoke from dozens of cooking fires rising into the clear morning air. The men she could see moving around the camp looked exactly as dangerous as she had expected, armed, rough, and radiating the kind of casual violence that marked professional criminals. Catherine's approach was spotted by sentries when she was still half a mile from the camp's perimeter. She held her white flag high and maintained a steady pace, fighting down the terror that threatened to overwhelm her rational thoughts. By the time she reached the camp's edge, a crowd of curious and hostile faces had gathered to see what kind of fool would ride alone into the stronghold of the territory's most feared outlaws. "I'm here to speak with Silas Kane," Catherine announced to the assembled crowd, her voice carrying more confidence than she felt. "I come under a flag of truce with terms from Pine Ridge Settlement." Rough laughter greeted this announcement, along with crude comments about what the men would like to do with their unexpected visitor. But the crowd parted to allow passage for a man who could only be Silas Kane himself. He was smaller than Catherine had expected, perhaps 5 feet 8 inches tall, but he radiated the kind of controlled menace that made physical size irrelevant. His eyes were pale blue and utterly cold, and his smile revealed teeth that had been filed to points in what was either a deliberate intimidation tactic or simply evidence of profound mental disturbance. "Miss Catherine Hartwell," Kane said, his voice carrying a cultured accent that surprised Catherine. "Yes, I know who you are, the school teacher who thinks she can make civilization bloom in the wilderness. How charming that you've come to visit." Catherine's blood turned to ice as she realized that Kane knew far more about Pine Ridge and its residents than their intelligence had suggested. But she forced herself to maintain composure, understanding that any sign of weakness would be fatal. "Mr. Kane," she replied formally, "I've come to discuss terms that might avoid unnecessary bloodshed when you approach Pine Ridge." Kane's pointed smile widened. "Oh, my dear girl, you misunderstand completely. I have no intention of avoiding bloodshed. I'm rather looking forward to it." The words hit Catherine like physical blows, but they also clarified the situation completely. Silas Kane wasn't simply a criminal seeking profit. He was a predator who enjoyed the suffering of others. Negotiation with such a man was impossible, but perhaps her real target had never been Kane himself. "I see," Catherine said calmly. "Then perhaps I should speak to your followers about what they can expect when Pine Ridge's allies arrive to investigate." "The smoking ruins of your camp." For the first time, Kane's smile faltered slightly. "Allies?" Catherine smiled with every ounce of confidence she could muster. "Did you really think Pine Ridge was isolated, Mr. Kane? We've spent the winter building connections with other settlements, territorial authorities, even some of the local Indian tribes who are tired of raiders disrupting their hunting grounds. Your attack on Pine Ridge won't be the easy victory you've planned. It will be the trigger for a coordinated response that will hunt down every member of your organization. It was a complete bluff, built on nothing more than Catherine's understanding of Kane's psychology and her desperate hope that some of his followers might be less committed to destruction than their leader. But as she looked around the camp, she could see uncertainty in faces that had been confidently hostile just moments before. The final confrontation between Catherine's words and Kane's authority was about to determine not just her fate, but the future of everyone she had come to love in Pine Ridge. Catherine's bluff hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, and she could see its effect rippling through Kane's assembled followers. The confidence that had marked their faces when she first arrived was cracking, replaced by uncertainty and growing unease. These men had signed on for what they believed would be an easy raid against an isolated settlement, not a war against coordinated territorial forces. "You're lying," Kane said, but his voice lacked its previous certainty. "Pine Ridge is alone. We've confirmed it." "Have you?" Catherine asked, maintaining her calm exterior while her heart hammered against her ribs. "Tell me, Mr. Kane, how many of your scouts have returned from the western valleys in the past month?" The question hit its mark perfectly. Catherine could see Kane's pale eyes flicker with the first sign of genuine concern. Daniel Cooper's intelligence network had indeed been active, and several of Kane's reconnaissance missions had simply vanished without trace, disappeared into the wilderness that Cooper knew better than any outlaw ever could. "That proves nothing," Kane snarled, but his followers were now openly murmuring among themselves. Catherine pressed her advantage. "Gentlemen," she addressed the crowd directly, ignoring Kane's growing fury, "I came here to offer you a choice. Continue following a man whose arrogance will get you all killed, or accept amnesty and the chance to build honest lives in territories where your past mistakes won't follow you." "Enough!" Kane's voice cracked like a whip, and his hand moved to the pistol at his belt. "Nobody speaks to my men without my permission." But Catherine had expected this moment, had prepared for the instant when words would give way to violence. As Kane's gun cleared its holster, she did something that shocked everyone present. She laughed. "Go ahead," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Shoot an unarmed woman carrying a flag of truce. Show your followers what kind of leader you really are." Kane's hand froze with the pistol halfway raised. Killing Catherine would violate every code of frontier justice, marking him as a coward and a man without honor. His followers might overlook many crimes, but murdering a defenseless woman would cross a line that even desperate men wouldn't stomach. "You think you're clever," Kane whispered, his finger still on the trigger. "But you've made one fatal mistake. You came here alone." "Did she?" A new voice called from the ridge above the camp. Every head turned to see Daniel Cooper sitting calmly on his horse, a rifle across his saddle, and the morning sun behind him casting his silhouette in sharp relief. As Catherine watched, more figures appeared on the surrounding ridges, at least 20 armed riders positioned to command the entire camp. Kane's face went white as he realized that his supposedly secure stronghold had been surrounded while he was distracted by Catherine's negotiations. The psychological warfare was complete. His followers could see that their leader had been outmaneuvered by a schoolteacher and a hermit rancher. "Now then," Catherine said pleasantly, "shall we discuss those amnesty terms?" What followed was the most extraordinary 20 minutes of Catherine's life. With Kane's authority shattered and Cooper's rifles commanding the high ground, the Crimson Brotherhood simply disintegrated. Nearly 60 men threw down their weapons and declared their willingness to accept Pine Ridge's amnesty offer. They were tired of running, tired of violence, tired of following a madman whose promises of easy plunder had led them into an obvious trap. Cain himself, along with his core of true believers, perhaps 20 hardened criminals who were beyond redemption, attempted to fight their way out of the encirclement. The battle was brief and decisive. Daniel Cooper's marksmen were positioned too well, and Cain's men were caught in an impossible tactical situation. When the gunfire finally stopped, Silas Cain lay dead in the dirt of his own camp, killed not by Catherine's words, but by his own refusal to accept that the frontier was changing. The age of unchecked lawlessness was ending, replaced by communities willing to stand together against those who would destroy what honest people built. The aftermath proved even more remarkable than the confrontation itself. True to Catherine's word, Pine Ridge welcomed the former raiders who sought amnesty, providing them with tools, supplies, and guidance for starting new lives. Some moved on to other territories, grateful for the second chance, but unwilling to remain near the scene of their former crimes. Others, impressed by what they had seen of the settlement's values and prosperity, requested permission to stay and contribute to the community they had once planned to destroy. Among these unexpected converts was a man named William Brady, a former Union Army sergeant who had turned to raiding after losing his farm to unscrupulous creditors. His military experience proved invaluable as Pine Ridge expanded its defensive capabilities and began coordinating security for the entire region. "Miss Hartwell," Brady said during one of the planning sessions that followed Cain's defeat, "I want you to know that what you did took more courage than any battlefield heroics I witnessed during the war. You risked everything on the belief that most people want to do right, given the chance." Catherine felt a warm glow of satisfaction at this praise, but her thoughts were already turning to the future. Cain's defeat had eliminated the immediate threat to Pine Ridge, but it had also established the settlement as a regional power, a beacon of stability that would attract both honest settlers and new forms of criminal attention. The summer months that followed brought unprecedented growth and prosperity. Word of Pine Ridge's victory over the Crimson Brotherhood spread throughout the territory, attracting families who had previously been too frightened to venture into the wilderness. The settlement expanded from 17 families to more than 40, requiring the construction of new buildings and the establishment of additional services. Catherine found herself at the center of these developments, no longer just a school teacher, but a community leader whose advice was sought on everything from territorial politics to marriage disputes. The shy seamstress, who had fled Boston to escape poverty, had become one of the most influential women in Colorado Territory. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. On a golden afternoon in late September, exactly 1 year after her arrival at the burnt Morrison homestead, Catherine stood in Pine Ridge's new church, a beautiful stone building that had replaced the temporary wooden structure. As Daniel Cooper took her hand in marriage, "Do you, Catherine Eleanor Hartwell, take Daniel Samuel Cooper to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Catherine replied, her voice strong and clear, carrying no trace of the fear that had once defined her existence. The ceremony was attended by the entire community, including Dolores Whitfield, who had traveled from her valley to witness the union of two people whose courage had helped transform the Colorado frontier. As Judge Morrison, Frank Morrison's brother, who had moved to Pine Ridge after learning of the settlement's success, pronounced them husband and wife, Catherine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come west seeking security as a mail-order bride, only to discover that true security came not from depending on others, but from finding the strength to protect what mattered most. The burnt homestead and fresh graves that had once represented the death of her dreams had become the foundation for something far greater than she had ever imagined. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Morrison announced to the assembled crowd, "I present Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Cooper." As applause filled the church and Daniel's strong arms encircled her, Catherine smiled with the deep contentment of someone who had found not just love, but purpose. The mysterious horseman who had once watched her from a distance had become her partner in building the kind of life that neither of them could have achieved alone. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall on Pine Ridge, transforming the settlement into a scene of pristine beauty. Children played in the streets, their laughter echoing off buildings that had been built to last for generations. Smoke rose from chimneys where families gathered around warm hearths, safe in the knowledge that their community would protect them from whatever dangers the frontier might bring. Catherine Hartwell had arrived in Colorado Territory as a refugee with nothing but hope and determination. Catherine Cooper would spend the rest of her life helping to build a civilization where hope and determination were rewarded with sanctuary, prosperity, and the chance to create something lasting from the raw materials of courage and community. The mail-order bride, who had found only graves and ashes, had discovered that sometimes the greatest sanctuaries are the ones we build ourselves, defended not by walls or weapons, but by the unshakable resolve of ordinary people who refuse to let fear triumph over love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.